The winter solstice was the most unforgiving season in the Winter Realm yet. Within the colossal stone walls of Winterborn Palace, the heat of political ambition was enough to melt the ancient frost. It had been precisely 1 week since Queen Eleanor stepped out of the royal carriage and reclaimed her residency within the castle. 1 week since the massive iron gates, which had stood like a jagged wound between the king and his wife, finally closed behind her, blocking out the freezing winds and locking in the terrifying reality of her return. But a palace is a living, breathing beast. It feeds on rumors, digests secrets, and exhales poison. And for 9 long weeks, while the Queen sat in exile at Rosemont Castle, the beast had grown bloated on the whispers of a broken royal marriage. Tonight was the solstice banquet. It was not merely a dinner, it was a theatre of war. Over 300 lords, ladies' emissaries, and barons from the 4 corners of the kingdom had gathered in the Great Hall. It would be Eleanor's first public appearance since her abrupt departure. The court was starving for blood. They wanted to look upon the face of the woman they believed had been humiliated, discarded, and only permitted to return by the desperate grace of a lonely king. Standing on the mezzanine overlooking the Great Hall, cloaked in the shadows of the arched marble pillars, stood Duchess Seraphina of the Southern Isles. Seraphina was 24 blessed, with cascading waves of spun gold hair and the kind of striking predatory beauty that made older men foolish and younger men dangerous. She had not returned to her southern estates when the Queen left 2 months ago. Instead, she had lingered. She had woven herself into the daily fabric of the court, offering her sympathies to the king, attending the minor council meetings, and filling the freezing silence of the palace with her bright, bell-like laughter. In her own mind, the crown was already resting upon her golden hair. Tonight, Seraphina had made a highly calculated choice of wardrobe. She wore a heavy sweeping gown of crimson velvet, deeply cut at the bodice and encrusted with black diamonds. Crimson was the color of the Valeris bloodline. It was a color traditionally reserved for the reigning monarch and his queen. Wearing it tonight was not a fashion statement. It was an act of architectural treason. "You look radiant, Your Grace," a low, oily voice murmured beside her. Lord Harrington, the master of the Southern Coin, stepped out of the shadows. He was a tall, sharply featured man whose arrogance was outmatched only by his greed. He held a silver goblet of spiced wine, his eyes tracking the frantic preparations of the servants below. "Radiance is a requirement, Harrington." Seraphina replied, not bothering to look at him. She adjusted the heavy diamond collar at her throat. "The court needs a reminder of what vitality looks like. I hear the Queen returned looking like a ghost, pale, exhausted, defeated." "Can you blame her?" Harrington chuckled softly, taking a slow sip of his wine. "She practically threw herself back at the castle gates. The rumor is, she begged the king on her knees at Rosemont to let her resume her title. A woman stripped of her pride is a pathetic creature. It is a tragedy His Majesty allowed her to return, out of pity for the princess." Seraphina's lips curled into a slow, venomous smile. "Pity is a fragile foundation for a throne. The king has tasted what it means to rule without her suffocating oversight. He has realized that he does not need a cold, calculating ledger-keeper for a wife. He needs warmth, he needs loyalty, he needs new blood. And the court is entirely in agreement, my dear Duchess," Harrington said, stepping closer. "During her 9 weeks of absence, I have ensured that the southern and eastern lords understand the financial benefits of a change in royal management. We are tired of Queen Eleanor's draconian trade tariffs. We are tired of her relentless audits. The king is a warrior. He does not care about the ledgers. If you press your advantage tonight, if you show the court that the queen is weak—" "She is already weak?" Seraphina interrupted, her eyes gleaming with absolute conviction. "A queen who abandons her throne because of a lover's quarrel has no iron in her spine. I will not just press an advantage tonight, Harrington. I will break her. By the time the final course is served, the entire Winterborn court will see her for the pathetic relic she is." Below them, the massive bronze doors of the Great Hall were thrown open by the royal guards. The booming echo of metal against stone commanded the immediate silence of the 300 nobles present. The master of ceremonies struck his heavy staff against the marble floor 3 times. The sound cracked like a whip through the vaulted room. His Royal Majesty King Alaric of House Valeris and Her Royal Majesty Queen Eleanor, the musicians in the gallery, immediately struck up the royal anthem, a heavy soaring melody composed of brass and cellos. The lords and ladies of the court scrambled to form two perfectly straight lines, bowing their heads in deep, practiced reverence. But beneath their lowered brows, hundreds of eyes darted upward, hungry and malicious, waiting to scrutinize the broken queen. King Alaric entered first. He was a terrifying vision of absolute monarchical power. He wore the formal military regalia of the Winter Realm, a high-collared tunic of midnight blue velvet, heavy silver epaulets, and a thick cape of dire wolf fur draped over his broad shoulders. At his hip rested the Valyrian broadsword, and upon his brow sat the jagged, imposing iron and diamond peaks of the winter crown. His face was a mask of chiseled granite, his icy blue eyes sweeping over the bowed court with the predatory calculation of an eagle assessing a field of mice. He did not look like a man who had been broken by heartbreak. He looked like a man who was daring anyone, to give him an excuse to draw his blade. And then, half a step behind him, came Queen Eleanor. The collective breath of the great hall seemed to catch and die in the frozen air. There was no ghost. There was no defeated pale woman clinging desperately to her husband's arm. Eleanor moved across the marble floor, and the sound of her heavy silk skirts sweeping against the stone was like the rushing of a dark tide. She was dressed in an absolute, unapologetic defiance of court expectations. She did not wear the soft pastels of a returning, apologetic wife. She wore a gown of impenetrable abyssal black silk, embroidered heavily with silver thread that looked like frost crawling up a midnight sky. The bodice was severe high-necked and flawless armor, masquerading as fabric, but it was her jewelry that made the breath stick in Seraphina's throat. Resting upon Eleanor's perfectly pinned dark hair was the sovereign star, a terrifyingly heavy ancient crown made of pure platinum and massive flawless sapphires. It was a crown older than the king's. It was the crown worn by the very first queen of the Winter Realm, a relic brought out only for declarations of war or absolute conquests. She did not look at the bowing lords. She looked straight ahead, her chin elevated at the exact mathematically perfect angle of supreme arrogance. Her dark eyes were unfathomable pools of obsidian. She emanated a freezing, lethal serenity. It was the terrifying calm of a woman who had already burned her own heart to ash and rebuilt it out of steel. Alaric reached the raised dais at the end of the hall. He turned, offering his hand to his queen. It was a standard protocol, but tonight the gesture carried the weight of an empire. He did not merely offer his hand, he locked his eyes onto hers, and for a fleeting, microscopic second the mask of the terrifying warrior king slipped, revealing a flash of absolute reverent devotion. Eleanor placed her gloved hand in his. The king of the Winter Realm bowed his head slightly to his wife before guiding her to the throne. He seated her first, ensuring her heavy skirts were perfectly arranged before he took his own place beside her. From the mezzanine, Seraphina felt a cold spike of dread pierce her confidence. The king had not looked at the queen with pity. He had looked at her like a man worshipping at an altar. "Do not let the pageantry fool you," Harrington whispered, sensing the Duchess's hesitation. "It is a show, an act for the lesser nobles to maintain stability. The cracks are there, Seraphina. You just have to strike the glass." Seraphina swallowed the lump in her throat, her ambition violently warring with her instinct for survival. She looked down at her crimson dress, suddenly acutely aware that next to the queen's abyssal black and blinding sapphire, she looked like a gaudy, over-decorated child playing in her mother's wardrobe. "I will strike," Seraphina hissed, gripping the stone balcony railing. "When the toasts begin, I will make her speak, and when she speaks, her weakness will bleed out for all to see." Down on the dais, Eleanor settled into the velvet cushions of her throne. She did not immediately look out at the sea of faces. She focused on the heavy silver goblet resting on the table before her. "They are looking at you," Alaric murmured, leaning slightly toward her, his voice barely carrying over the swelling music. His tone was a low, protective growl. "Half of them are hoping you trip, and the other half are calculating how to exploit the rumors of our separation. Say the word, Eleanor. Say one word, and I will have my guards clear this hall and send every last one of these vultures back to their freezing estates." Eleanor slowly lifted her dark eyes. She let her gaze sweep over the room, pausing specifically on the crimson splash of color standing on the mezzanine. She saw Seraphina. She saw Harrington. She saw the hungry, pathetic little wolf circling her throne. A chilling microscopic smile touched the very corner of the queen's mouth. "Let them look. Alaric," Eleanor replied softly, her voice possessing the terrifying smoothness of a silken cord wrapping around a throat. "Let them gorge themselves on their own arrogant assumptions. A swift execution is a mercy, and tonight I am entirely out of mercy." 3 hours before the heavy bronze doors of the great hall had been thrown open to the expectant court, the atmosphere inside the king and queen's private chambers had been infinitely more volatile than the freezing winter storm raging outside the castle windows. The royal bedchamber was a cavernous room of dark oak thick tapestries and a massive stone hearth where a roaring fire fought desperately against the pervasive chill of the winter realm. Yet despite the heat of the flames, King Alaric emanated an aura of pure glacial fury. He paced the length of the Persian rug, his heavy leather riding boots striking the floorboards with the rhythmic, terrifying thud of a war drum. He had not yet donned his ceremonial military tunic. He wore only a loose linen shirt, the collar undone, revealing the faint silver scar of past battles across his collarbone. But the warrior before the hearth was not thinking of old wars. He was entirely consumed by a new one. "I will take his head." Alaric snarled, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to rattle the crystal goblets on the side table. "I will march down to the southern wing, drag Lord Harrington out of his velvet-lined chambers by his hair, and sever his head on the courtyard cobblestones. And then I will mount it on a spike at the gates of his precious southern isles." Queen Eleanor sat before her massive silver-gilded vanity. She was perfectly still, a stark contrast to her husband's explosive momentum. Her ladies-in-waiting had been dismissed an hour ago. She was alone with the king entirely in her element, methodically pinning the heavy, abyssal black silk of her mourning-turned conquest gown. She did not turn around. She watched Alaric's reflection in the towering mercury glass mirror. "You will do no such thing, my king." She said, her voice as smooth and undisturbed as the surface of the Black Lake. "He has spent the last 9 weeks poisoning the Eastern Lords against you." Alaric stopped pacing, turning to face her back. His hands curled into massive fists. The Lord Commander of the King's Guard had just delivered the Master of Whispers' final report. It was a vile catalogue of every insult, every sneer, and every treasonous suggestion Harrington and Seraphina had seeded through the court during Eleanor's absence. "He told Baron Vance that your departure was a sign of mental frailty. He suggested to the High Magistrate that my mercy in allowing you to return makes the crown look weak." Alaric closed the distance between them, his towering frame casting a massive shadow over the vanity. "And Seraphina," he spat the Duchess's name as if it were a foul taste on his tongue. "She has commissioned a gown of Valerian crimson for tonight. She intends to stand before the entire court and mock your authority by wearing the colors of my bloodline. I will strip her of her title, seize her archipelago, and banish her to the frozen northern waste before the first course is even served." He reached out his large calloused hand, gently resting on Eleanor's bare shoulder, his thumb brushing the line of her collarbone. The touch was incredibly tender, a jarring juxtaposition to the absolute violence in his eyes. "I promised you, Eleanor, in the glass house. I promised I would put better words into the stones of this castle. I will not allow them to disrespect you in my home. I will burn their houses to the ground." Eleanor finally stopped what she was doing. She set down a silver hairpin. The soft clink of metal against glass echoed sharply in the quiet room. She reached up and covered his large hand with her own, lacing her delicate fingers through his. Then she turned on the velvet stool to face him fully. "If you kill Harrington tonight, Alaric, what do you think the court will whisper tomorrow?" She asked, her dark eyes locking onto his stormy blue ones. "They will whisper that I am a king who defends his queen's honor." Alaric answered without hesitation, "No." Eleanor corrected softly, but with the absolute authority of a master tactician correcting a novice. "They will whisper that you have lost your mind. They will say that the exiled queen returned whispered poison into your ear in the dark of the royal bedchamber and bewitched you into executing one of the realm's most powerful financial ministers. They will not fear me, Alaric. They will resent me. They will see me as a weak, manipulative woman hiding behind the terrifying shadow of her tyrant husband's broadsword. Alaric's jaw tightened. He knew strategically she was making sense, but the primal protective rage roaring in his blood demanded immediate justice. I do not care what they whisper so long as they fear to speak it aloud. But I care. Eleanor said, her voice dropping, an octave taking on a deadly chilling weight. She stood up. Even without her crown, she commanded the room entirely. I did not endure 9 weeks of exile. I did not swallow my pride and return to a court that thinks I am broken just to have you fight my battles, like a tavern brawler. She stepped closer to him, the heavy black silk of her skirts brushing against his boots. Blood is cheap, Alaric. Fear born of a sword lasts only until the sword is sheathed, or until a sharper sword comes along. Harrington controls the southern grain. Seraphina's fleet secures the archipelago. If you execute them in a fit of royal rage without public irrefutable justification, you will fracture the kingdom. You will spark a civil war over a wounded ego. Then what is your solution? Alaric asked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, his frustration warring with his profound respect for her intellect. Do we smile? Do we drink their wine and pretend we do not hear the treason dripping from their teeth? Oh, we will drink their wine. Eleanor smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a viper, assessing the exact point to strike. And we will smile, but we will not pretend. She turned back to the vanity, opening a hidden drawer built into the heavy oak. She withdrew 3 leather-bound ledgers. They were not the pristine, gold-embossed books of the royal treasury. They were battered, stained with sea salt, and bound in cheap twine. She dropped them onto the vanity. They landed with a heavy, final thud. For 9 weeks, the court thought I was weeping by the fire at Rosemont Castle, Eleanor said, trailing her elegant fingertips over the worn leather covers. They thought my grief over our separation had rendered me blind and deaf to the world. They forgot that I am the architect of this kingdom's trade. She picked up the first ledger and held it out to him. This is the true accounting of the southern coin. Harrington has not merely been insulting me, my king. He has been skimming 10% of the winter grain tax for the past 3 years. When I left, he thought the audit was over. He grew sloppy. He signed the diversion orders himself. Alaric took the ledger, flipping it open. His eyes scanned the messy, hurried ink. The rage in his chest began to transmutate from a chaotic fire into a cold, sharpened spear. This is high treason. Absolute, undeniable treason. And this, Eleanor picked up the second ledger, is a detailed manifest from the docks of the Southern Isles. Duchess Seraphina has not just been dreaming of wearing your crown. She has been funding that dream by smuggling untaxed Valyrian iron to the Eastern warlords, the very warlords you fought 3 winters ago. Alaric looked up from the ledgers, his breath catching in his throat. He looked at his wife standing there in her abyssal black gown, holding the ruin of 2 of the most powerful houses in the kingdom in her delicate hands. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. She was the most dangerous creature he had ever known. But you didn't just survive your exile. Alaric whispered, absolute awe bleeding into his voice. You weaponized it. You gave them enough rope to hang themselves. I removed the light. Eleanor corrected smoothly, stepping into his space and resting her hands on his chest. And I watched the rats crawl out of the walls. When a queen steps down, the corrupt rush to fill the vacuum. They thought they were taking my power. In reality, they were just stepping into my trap. She looked up into his eyes, her expression turning terrifyingly serious. I need a promise from you tonight, Alaric. The hardest promise you will ever make. Name it. When the banquet begins, Eleanor commanded softly, you will sit on your throne and you will do absolutely nothing. Alaric frowned, every instinct in his body rebelling against the order. Eleanor! Nothing, she repeated firmly, her fingers digging slightly into his linen shirt. When they make their veiled insults, you will not reach for your sword. When Seraphina parades her crimson dress, you will not sneer. You will play the part of the neutral, observing monarch. You will let them feel victorious. You will let them climb to the very peak of their arrogance. You are asking me to watch them disrespect you? Alaric growled, his jaw locked in defiance. I am asking you to let me rule. Eleanor countered, her voice ringing with absolute unyielding authority. I am not your fragile bride, Alaric. I am the queen of the Winter Realm. I must show them that my power does not flow from your protection. It flows from my own mind. If you step in, you steal my victory. You reduce me to a maiden, needing a knight." She reached up her hands, framing his face, forcing him to look at her. Really look at her. "Let me be their executioner tonight. Let me show the court why I am the only woman fit to wear the sovereign star. And when they finally fall, all I ask is that you are sitting beside me to watch the kingdom kneel." Alaric stared into the dark, bottomless depths of his wife's eyes. He saw the fire there. He saw the brilliant, ruthless intellect that had held his kingdom together for 7 years. He had spent so long believing he was the shield of the Winter Realm, only to realize that the woman in his arms had always been the blade. Slowly the tension bled out of his shoulders. The chaotic rage faded, replaced by a profound, chilling anticipation. A terrifying smile broke across the king's face. "As you command, my queen," Alaric whispered. He leaned down and pressed a fierce, bruising kiss to her forehead. "I will sit upon the throne. I will drink the spiced wine, and I will watch you burn them all to ash." Eleanor turned back to the vanity. She reached into a velvet box and lifted the sovereign star. She did not ask him to place it on her head. She raised her hands, the heavy platinum and sapphires catching the firelight, and crowned herself. The transition was instantaneous. The woman vanished, replaced entirely by the monarch. "Come, my king," Eleanor said, the chilling serenity returning to her voice as she turned toward the heavy oak doors. "The court is hungry. Let us go feed them." The winter solstice banquet was an exercise in glittering, suffocating excess. The great hall of Winterbourne Palace had been transformed from a cavernous stone fortress into a theater of overwhelming opulence. 1,000 thick beeswax candles burned fiercely, and the massive wrought iron chandeliers suspended from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm golden and entirely deceptive glow over the courtiers below. The air was thick with the scent of roasted venison, spiced winter wine, burning pine, and the heavy, expensive perfumes of 300 nobles sweating beneath their velvets and silks. From the carved wooden gallery, above a royal string quartet, played a complex sweeping sonata. The music was beautiful, but manic, the cellos groaning like ice cracking on a frozen river, the violins sharp and relentless. It was a perfect auditory reflection of the political undercurrent tearing through the room. At the raised Duchess at the far end of the hall, the high table was set with plates of solid gold and goblets of cut-lead crystal. King Alaric and Queen Eleanor sat side by side, elevated above the sea of nobles looking out over the feast. The physical contrast between the king and queen and the rest of the court was absolute. The lords and ladies had dressed in chaotic splashes of bright colors, emerald green, sapphire blues, and most aggressively the deep crimson worn by Duchess Seraphina, who had strategically positioned herself at the table closest to the royal dais. Against this vibrant display of vanity, Alaric and Eleanor sat like two gods of death presiding over a mortal folly. Alaric in his midnight blue and dire wolf fur, Eleanor in her abyssal black silk, and the terrifyingly heavy platinum of the sovereign star. For the first 2 hours of the banquet, the tension was a physical, crushing weight in the room. The court ate, but they did not taste their food. Every clink of a silver fork against a porcelain plate, every rustle of heavy silk as a lady leaned over to whisper behind her fan was amplified in the oppressive atmosphere. Hundreds of eyes continuously darted toward the high table, waiting for the facade of royal unity to shatter. They waited for the queen to cast a nervous, pleading glance at her husband. They waited for the king to treat her with the cold indifference that the rumors had promised. Neither happened. Eleanor sat with flawless, terrifying posture. She barely touched the roasted fowl on her plate, instead holding a crystal goblet of dark red wine by its delicate stem, taking slow, measured sips. She did not speak to the lords seated at the lower tables. She did not need to. Her presence alone, the icy perfection of her features, and the chilling weight of her ancient crown, was a statement that demanded total submission. Beside her, Alaric played his part with the devastating skill of a man who had spent his life masking his intentions on the battlefield. He engaged in sparse, polite conversation with the high priest seated to his left, but his jaw was tight. Every instinct in his massive frame was screaming at him to draw his broadsword and paint the marble floor with the blood of the nobles who dared to look at his wife with anything less than absolute reverence. He could see the crimson dress of Duchess Seraphina in the periphery of his vision. He could see her leaning toward Lord Harrington, whispering her bright laughter, occasionally piercing the heavy hum of the hall. He felt the phantom weight of Eleanor's hand on his chest from hours ago. When the banquet begins, you will sit on your throne and you will do absolutely nothing. Alaric took a deep breath, forced his hands to remain loosely draped over the carved armrests of his throne, and waited. The turning point of the evening arrived when the final course of spun sugar and winter berries was cleared away. The master of ceremonies struck his staff against the stone floor, signaling the beginning of the formal toasts. The low hum of conversation instantly died. The string quartet lowered their bows. The silence that rushed into the great hall was absolute and deafening. Traditionally, the first toast belonged to the king, but Alaric, leaning back in his throne, merely raised a hand granting the floor to the court. It was a subtle, dangerous invitation. He was opening the gates of the fortress and inviting the wolves inside. Lord Harrington was the first to rise. The master of the southern coin stood up from his table, smoothing the expensive silver embroidery of his doublet. He picked up his goblet, turning to face the royal dais. A smarmy practiced smile stretched across his sharp features. To His Majesty the King of the Winter Realm. Harrington's voice boomed out, designed to echo off the vaulted ceilings. We raise our glasses tonight in gratitude. This past season has been a time of difficult transitions. It has been a season that tested the strength of our borders and the stability of our halls. Yet through it all, King Alaric stood as a solitary, unyielding pillar of strength. He proved that the Valerius crown requires no assistance to bear the crushing weight of the empire. To the king's solitary strength. To the king! The court echoed the sound of 300 voices overlapping. It was a masterclass in political poison. On the surface, it was a compliment to the monarch. Beneath the surface, it was a brutal public declaration that the queen's 9-week absence had not mattered, that she was unnecessary, and that the king was better off ruling alone. Alaric did not smile. He simply raised his glass an inch, acknowledging the toast, and took a sip. He did not look at Eleanor. He did not defend her. A ripple of electric excitement surged through the court. The king had not corrected Harrington. The king had allowed the insult to stand. The rumors were true. The queen was entirely without protection. Sensing the blood in the water, Duchess Seraphina stood up. The crimson velvet of her gown caught the candlelight, the black diamonds at her throat glittering like dark, hungry eyes. She stepped away from her table, moving intentionally closer to the steps of the royal dais, placing herself directly in the center of the hall's attention. She moved with the predatory grace of a woman who believed she had already won the war. If I may, your majesties. Seraphina said, her voice honeyed, ringing with a false sickly sweetness that made Alaric's blood boil. She raised her gold goblet, fixing her striking green eyes directly on Eleanor. We must also raise a glass to Her Majesty Queen Eleanor. Seraphina began, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. We were all so deeply grieved by your sudden departure. The harshness of the winter winds can take a terrible toll on a delicate constitution. We understand that the crushing, relentless duties of the crown, the endless ledgers, the diplomatic disputes, the management of the court can simply become too much for one woman to bear. A collective breathless gasp swept through the lower tables. This was no longer a veiled insult. It was a direct public assassination of the Queen's competence. To call a ruling monarch delicate or incapable of bearing her duties was a catastrophic insult in the Winter Realm. Eleanor did not flinch. She did not grip the arms of her throne. She merely tilted her head a fraction of an inch, her expression remaining entirely chillingly blank. Emboldened by the Queen's silence, Seraphina took another step closer to the dais, addressing Alaric directly, though her words were meant as daggers for Eleanor. Your Majesty, Seraphina said, placing a hand over her heart in a gesture of profound theatrical loyalty. Seeing the Queen looking so fatigued upon her return breaks the hearts of your loyal subjects. It is not right that she should suffer under the heavy yoke of administration when she clearly requires rest. Therefore, I humbly offer myself and the resources of the Southern Isles to ease her burden. Seraphina turned back to Eleanor, offering a smile that was nothing short of a declaration of war. Allow me to take over the planning of the spring trade routes, Your Majesty. Allow me to host the foreign dignitaries and manage the winter treasury audits. You need not trouble your weary mind with such tedious politics any more. Rest, my queen. Let the younger, stronger blood of the court carry the weight your shoulders can no longer support. The great hall plunged into a silence so profound, so terrifyingly deep, that the sound of a single drop of wax hitting the marble floor echoed like a gunshot. Seraphina had just publicly petitioned to strip the queen of her core sovereign powers and transfer them to herself. It was a bloodless coup executed over dessert and wine. All 300 nobles turned their heads in absolute unison toward the throne. They looked at King Alaric. If the king truly despised his wife, if the rumors were absolute fact, he would nod. He would thank the Duchess for her service and effectively end Eleanor's reign with a single sip of wine. Alaric sat on his throne. His massive hands rested on the carved armrests. The veins in his neck were thick with suppressed violent rage. He looked at Seraphina, his icy blue eyes entirely devoid of warmth. He wanted to draw his sword so badly his muscles ached. He wanted to cleave the Duchess in half and throw her crimson dress into the hearth. But he remembered the dark, bottomless depths of his wife's eyes in their bedchamber. Let me be their executioner tonight. Alaric slowly, deliberately picked up his crystal goblet. He took a sip of the spiced wine. He swallowed. And then he leaned back in his throne, turning his head to look at Eleanor, completely ignoring Seraphina's petition. He did absolutely nothing. A collective thrill of malicious victory shot through the court. The Duchess Seraphina's smile widened into a beam of pure, arrogant triumph. Lord Harrington chuckled into his cup. The queen was finished. The king had abandoned her to the wolves. Slowly, the heavy silk of Queen Eleanor's abyssal black gown rustled as she shifted her weight. She did not look at Alaric. She did not look at Harrington. She fixed her gaze entirely upon the beaming face of Duchess Seraphina. Eleanor placed her crystal goblet down on the gold plate. The clink was sharp, crisp, and terrifyingly final. She placed her hands flat upon the arms of her throne, and with a slow, deliberate grace that commanded the oxygen in the room, the Queen of the Winter Realm stood up. The heavy sovereign star gleamed upon her brow. Her shadow cast by the 1,000 candles stretched long and dark across the marble steps of the dais, falling directly over Seraphina's crimson dress like a shroud. Younger, stronger blood, Eleanor repeated. Her voice was not loud, yet it possessed an acoustic quality that made it sound as though she was speaking directly into the ear of every single person in the hall. It was a voice forged in absolute, unquestionable authority. Eleanor took one step down the dais, descending toward the court. How remarkably generous of you, Duchess Seraphina, the queen said, her lips curving into a smile that lacked any trace of human warmth. To offer to carry the weight of an empire. But tell me, how does one carry the weight of the crown when her own hands are stained with the soot of treason? The word treason hung in the air of the great hall, suspended like a guillotine blade over the banquet tables. Duchess Seraphina's practiced honeyed smile did not immediately vanish, but it froze, turning brittle and unnatural against her pale face. The black diamonds at her throat caught the frantic flickering of the chandeliers as her breathing shallowly quickened. She looked desperately toward the high table, her eyes darting to King Alaric. She expected the king to intercede, to scold his unwell wife for making such wild, paranoid accusations in front of the assembled nobility. King Alaric sat perfectly motionless. His massive hands remained relaxed on the arms of his throne. He did not look at Seraphina. He was watching Queen Eleanor with a look of terrifying, absolute devotion. Treason! Seraphina managed to say, her voice losing its ringing confidence, dropping into a breathless, defensive stutter. Your Majesty, I fear the winter chill has truly clouded your judgment. I have offered you nothing but my loyal service and the resources of the Southern Isles. To speak of treason is an outrage, Lord Harrington barked, stepping forcefully out from behind his table. He puffed his chest out, attempting to project the formidable authority of the master of the Southern coin. Your Majesty, this is a blatant hysterical insult. The Duchess has been the very picture of grace during your unfortunate absence. To accuse her of treason without a shred of it. Did I give you permission to speak, Harrington? Eleanor's voice was not raised. It did not need to be. The quiet, deadly precision of her tone sliced through the master of coin's bluster, like a Valyrian steel blade severing a silk thread. Harrington's mouth snapped shut. His face flushed a dark, angry purple, but the sheer crushing weight of the Queen's authority nailed his boots to the marble floor. Eleanor descended the final step of the dais. She stood on the same level as the court, yet she seemed to tower over them all. The abyssal black of her gown swallowed the light around her, and the sapphire eyes of the sovereign star upon her brow glared down at the conspirators. She did not look back at the king. She raised her right hand, her gloved fingers, making a single sharp gesture toward the shadows behind the royal dais. Immediately the heavy, rhythmic thud of armored boots echoed through the silent hall. The Lord Commander of the King's Guard, a scarred veteran who answered directly to the throne, emerged from the darkness. He was not carrying a sword. He was carrying 3 thick, weathered leather ledgers. The court watched in breathless, mounting horror as the Lord Commander marched past the king, descended the steps, and placed the ledgers directly onto the grand oak table nearest to Seraphina and Harrington. The heavy thud of the books hitting the wood sounded like dirt hitting a coffin lid. You believed I was mourning. Eleanor began, her voice gliding over the terrified silence of the room. She began to walk a slow predatory circle around the table where the ledgers lay. The rustle of her heavy silk skirts was the only other sound in the vast hall. You believed that when I returned to Rosemont Castle, I locked myself in a tower, wept over my fractured marriage, and allowed the world to spin on without me. She stopped pacing and fixed her obsidian eyes on Lord Harrington. The arrogant master of coin suddenly looked very small. I did weep, Harrington. Eleanor said softly, a chilling confession that made the court hold its collective breath. I wept for the state of my kingdom, because the moment I stepped away from the light, I watched the vermin crawl out from the floorboards to gorge themselves on my granaries. Eleanor reached out with one elegant black-gloved hand and flipped open the first ledger. This is not a royal treasury book, she stated, her voice echoing off the high stone vaults. This is a dockmaster's log from the port of Oak Haven, dated 3 weeks ago, during the height of the winter freeze when the lower provinces were begging the crown for relief. You, Lord Harrington, authorized the diversion of 12,000 bushels of winter grain. Harrington's face drained of its purple, rage turning the color of old ash. That was an emergency reallocation for the southern garrison. Do not lie to me in my own hall. Eleanor's voice finally cracked, like a whip, the sudden sharp volume making several lords physically flinch. The mask of calm slipped just enough to reveal the terrifying dragon beneath. The southern garrison received nothing. You diverted the grain to private merchant vessels bound for the free cities across the narrow sea. You sold my people's survival for foreign gold. You skimmed 10% of the winter tax, signed the forged diversion orders with your own hand. And you did it all while drinking my husband's wine and whispering that I was too weak to rule. She slammed the ledger shut. The sound made Seraphina jump. Whispers erupted like wildfire among the lower tables. The eastern and northern lords whose lands had suffered the worst of the winter shortages turned their glares upon Harrington. The Master of Coin looked around frantically, realizing in real time that the alliances he had bought with stolen gold were evaporating into thin air. Your Majesty, I can explain... Harrington stammered, stepping backward. You will have ample time to explain yourself to the royal executioner. Eleanor replied, her voice returning to that freezing, lethal calm. She did not even look at him anymore. She had already discarded him. She turned slowly, her heavy skirts swirling around her, and locked her gaze onto Duchess Seraphina. The golden-haired Duchess had backed away until her crimson dress was pressed against a stone pillar. The arrogant, victorious woman from 5 minutes ago was gone, replaced by a trembling girl who had suddenly realized she had walked into a lion's den wearing meat. And you! Eleanor murmured, stepping closer to Seraphina. The contrast was devastating. The queen in her ancient platinum and black silk forged in the fires of actual rulership, standing over the trembling Duchess masquerading in stolen colors. You offered to ease my burden, Eleanor said, reaching out to trace a single gloved fingertip over the leather cover of the second ledger. You offered to manage the spring trade routes. Tell me, Duchess, did your proposed trade routes include the continuous smuggling of Valerian iron to the warlords of the eastern steppes? Seraphina let out a choked gasp. Her hands flew to her throat, her manicured fingers clawing at her diamond collar, as if it was suddenly choking her. No, Seraphina whispered, her eyes wide with terror. No, that is a lie. A fabrication. I do not deal in fabrications. Seraphina! Eleanor said, her tone almost conversational, which somehow made it infinitely worse. I deal in manifests. I deal in the harbour seals of your own southern archipelago. For 2 months you have used your private fleet to bypass the royal blockade. You have been selling weapons to the very men who slaughtered 3,000 of our soldiers 3 winters ago. Eleanor took a step closer, invading Seraphina's personal space. The Queen leaned in, her voice dropping to a terrifying, intimate whisper, meant only for the Duchess and those immediately surrounding her. You thought wearing crimson would make you a queen. Eleanor breathed, her eyes devoid of any mercy. You thought my husband was lonely, and that you could simply slide into my bed and onto my throne while I was away. But you are not a Queen Seraphina. A queen protects her people. You sold their blood for iron. You are nothing but a common smuggler dressed in my family's colors. Seraphina's knees buckled. She slid down the cold stone pillar, the heavy crimson velvet pooling uselessly around her on the floor. She covered her face with her trembling hands, a pathetic sob tearing from her throat. Eleanor turned away from the sobbing Duchess. She looked out over the 300 lords and ladies of the Winterborn court. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a kingdom that had forgotten the taste of true unyielding authority and was suddenly choking on it. For 7 years! Eleanor's voice rang out clear and powerful, striking every corner of the great hall. I managed the ledgers. I negotiated the treaties. I ensured the survival of this realm while you feasted in these halls. And when I stepped away, you did not grieve for the kingdom. You rejoiced at the opportunity to tear it apart. She walked slowly back toward the dais, her heavy gaze sweeping over the crowd. Noblemen who had whispered insults just hours ago now stared at their boots, terrified to meet her eyes. Let this night serve as your final lesson. Eleanor proclaimed, stopping at the bottom of the marble steps. My power does not exist because I sit beside the king. My power exists because I built the foundation upon which you all stand. I am the architect of the Winter Realm, and if you attempt to crack the stones of my house, again, I will not simply banish you to the cold. She turned and began to ascend the steps toward the throne. I will bury you beneath it. She reached the top of the dais. King Alaric was standing now. He did not look at the court. He looked only at her. The fierce, terrifying pride in his icy blue eyes was blinding. He offered his hand. Eleanor placed her hand in his. Together, the king and queen of the Winter Realm turned to face the ruined court. Lord Commander, Eleanor said, not raising her voice, but knowing it would be obeyed instantly. Your Majesty. The armored knight stepped forward, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. Lord Harrington and Duchess Seraphina are under arrest for high treason against the crown. Eleanor decreed, her voice as cold and final as a winter avalanche. Strip them of their titles, seize their assets, and throw them in the black cells beneath the lake. Harrington fell to his knees, his hands clasped together in desperate, frantic prayer. Mercy, your Majesty, King Alaric, please. I beg of you, I have served your father, mercy. The entire court watched, holding their breath. They looked to the king. This was the final test. If Alaric possessed any lingering doubt, any desire to undermine his wife and assert his own dominance, he would grant a stay of execution. He would offer clemency. King Alaric looked down at the groveling master of coin. His face was a mask of chiseled stone. You heard the queen, Alaric said, his voice echoing with the absolute, terrifying finality of a monarch who had found his true north. Take them. The screams of Duchess Seraphina were the first to shatter the frozen silence. As the armored gauntlets of the Kingsguard clamped down upon her bare shoulders, the illusion of her royal destiny evaporated entirely. She thrashed against the iron grip of the soldiers, her heavy crimson velvet gown twisting and tearing against the cold marble floor. You cannot do this! Seraphina shrieked, the sound raw and desperate, echoing horribly off the vaulted ceilings. I am a Duchess of the blood, my fleet! Your fleet belongs to the crown now. Eleanor stated, her voice as flat and unyielding as a stone wall. Take her! Beside her, Lord Harrington did not fight. The master of coin had gone entirely limp, his sharp features sagging into a mask of absolute catatonic horror. He was dragged backward by his collar, the silver embroidery of his expensive doublet scraping pitifully against the floorboards. He knew the laws of the Winter Realm better than anyone. There was no ransom for treason against the Sovereign Star. The heavy bronze doors of the Great Hall were hauled open. The brutal winter wind howled into the room for a brief freezing second, mingling with Seraphina's fading hysterical sobs. Then the doors slammed shut with a concussive boom that vibrated through the boots of every noble present. The threat was gone. The architects of the court's prison had been excised like rot from a wound. But the terror in the Great Hall had not dissipated. If anything, it had thickened. The 300 lords and ladies of the Winterborn court were now trapped in a cavernous room with a king who looked ready to draw his blade, and a queen who had just proved she didn't even need one to destroy them. Eleanor stood at the edge of the dais, looking down at the sea of pale, terrified faces. She let the silence stretch. She let them stew in the acidic realization of their own catastrophic miscalculations. It was Lord Vance, an elderly silver-haired baron from the Eastern Marches, who broke the stalemate. He stepped out from the trembling ranks of the nobility, his knees shaking so violently, his silk trousers rustled. He moved to the very center of the center aisle, directly in front of the royal dais. Slowly, painfully, the old lord sank to his knees. He bowed his head so low, his forehead nearly touched the freezing marble. "Your Majesty," Lord Vance's voice wavered thick with genuine shame. "We have been fools. We allowed the shadows of this palace to blind us to the light that sustains it. We mistook your grace for frailty and your patience for weakness. We beg the forgiveness of the true queen of the Winter Realm." As if his words had severed the invisible strings holding the rest of the court upright, the nobility collapsed. It started in the front rows and rippled backward like a wave crashing against a dark shore. Dukes, earls, baronesses, and knights all dropped to their knees. The rustle of heavy fabrics, velvets, furs, and silks swept through the hall in a massive synchronized sigh of total submission. Within seconds, 300 of the most powerful people in the kingdom were kneeling on the hard stone floor, their heads bowed, refusing to look upon the absolute power they had dared to mock. King Alaric stepped forward. He moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with his queen. He looked down at the kneeling court, his icy blue eyes blazing with a fierce, possessive pride. He rested his hand on the hilt of his Valerian broadsword, not to draw it, but to restate a fundamental truth of his reign. "You look upon the architect of your survival." Alaric's voice boomed rich and resonant, rolling over the bowed heads of his subjects like thunder. "You look upon the woman who counted your grain, secured your borders, and bled her own soul dry to ensure this kingdom did not fracture in the cold. You thought my silence tonight was an abandonment of my wife." Alaric turned slightly, his gaze softening, only as it landed upon Eleanor's flawless, severe profile. "My silence was not abandonment," the king declared, his voice carrying the weight of a sacred vow. "It was reverence. I did not step forward to defend the queen because a dragon does not require a shield to deal with sheep." A collective shudder ran through the kneeling nobles. Let it be known, from the frozen northern peaks to the southern archipelago. Alaric continued, his tone turning into a lethal promise. "Queen Eleanor does not rule by my permission. She rules by her own sovereign right, forged in her unmatched intellect and her unyielding devotion to this realm. If any man or woman in this hall ever dares to whisper against her, to question her authority, or to mistake her mercy for weakness again, you will not face the Queen's ledgers. You will face my blade, and I will not leave enough of you behind to fill a beggar's grave. Do you understand?" "Yes, your Majesty," the court murmured in chaotic, terrifying unison, a chorus of trembling voices. Alaric turned fully to Eleanor. The terrifying warrior king, the monarch who had just threatened his entire court with annihilation, bowed his head to the woman beside him. It was not a shallow nod of courtesy. It was a deep, profound bow of absolute respect from one sovereign to another. Eleanor looked at her husband. The abyssal black of her eyes softened just a fraction. The ice in her chest, the lingering bitter frost of her exile, finally completely shattered. She saw the man who had learned her worth. She saw the king who had finally learned how to stand beside her, rather than simply standing in front of her. She turned her attention back to the court. "Rise," Eleanor commanded softly. The court scrambled to their feet, a messy, terrified mass of nobility, desperately trying to regain their composure. "The banquet is concluded," Eleanor stated, her voice returning to its smooth, chilling serenity. "Return to your chambers. Tomorrow the royal auditors We'll visit each of your estates. We will review the winter taxes. We will review the trade manifests. And we will see exactly where your true loyalties lie. Good night, my lords and ladies." She did not wait for their bows. She turned her heavy black silk skirts, swirling violently around her, and walked toward the private exit behind the throne. King Alaric followed her, his heavy boots matching her commanding stride. They walked in silence through the long, dimly lit corridors of the royal wing, the sounds of the panicked court fading behind them, replaced only by the crackle of the torches in the silver sconces and the echoing of their own footsteps. As soon as the heavy oak doors of their private bedchamber closed behind them, locking the world out once more, the rigid, terrifying posture of the Winter Queen finally dissolved. Eleanor let out a long, shuddering breath. She reached up her gloved hands, grasping the heavy platinum of the sovereign star. She lifted it from her head and set it down on the velvet cushion of her vanity. The clink of the metal was soft, exhausted. Alaric stepped up behind her. He didn't speak. He simply wrapped his massive arms around her waist, pulling her back flush against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her skin and the faint metallic smell of the winter air that still clung to her hair. Eleanor closed her eyes, leaning all of her weight back into him. Her hands came up to rest over his thick forearms. "You were terrifying," Alaric murmured against her skin, his voice a low, vibrating hum that sent a shiver down her spine. "I have conquered 3 armies, Eleanor. I have faced warlords and assassins. But watching you methodically dismantle that Duchess, I have never been more frightened of a human being in my entire life." Eleanor let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was a beautiful, weary sound that broke the final remnants of the evening's tension. "She made it entirely too easy, Alaric. Arrogance is a very predictable disease." Alaric turned her around in his arms. He looked down at her, his icy eyes searching her face. The severe, untouchable monarch of the Great Hall was gone. In her place was the woman he loved, brilliant, ruthless, and entirely his. "You did not just punish them tonight," Alaric said softly, his thumbs gently stroking her cheekbones. "You showed them the truth. You showed me the truth too. I spent 7 years thinking I was the foundation of this castle. I was wrong." Eleanor looked up at him, her dark eyes shining in the firelight. "We are the foundation, Alaric. Both of us. The sword and the ledger. The winter and the architect. One cannot hold the empire without the other." "I know," he whispered, leaning down. "I know it now. I will never forget it again." He kissed her then. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of a man trying to win back a lost wife. It was the deep, consuming, and fiercely protective kiss of a king sealing an eternal alliance with his queen. It was a promise forged in the fires of their near destruction, harder and stronger than Valyrian steel. Outside, the brutal winds of the Winter Realm continued to howl, battering against the ancient stone walls of Winterborn Palace. But inside the royal bedchamber, the storm had finally broken. The king had learned how to bow, the queen had reclaimed her power, and the throne was united once more, unbreakable and absolute. They had survived the winter. And heaven help anyone who ever tried to bring the cold into their house again.